main section is in sonata form, and it begins straight away with the main theme. And so on. So the half step is still the main element, but now there's an extra added note. And at this point, it's like the music is still sort of warming itself up in a way. We have this, it's staying at the same place for a long time, repeating. Then when it moves up, it stays again at this new place for a long time. And the accompaniment is very sparse, there's just these chords. And the music is not so active in general, so it's still as if it's just warming itself up, so to say. And some important points here are that the initial idea, where we move ahead by going a half step up, is now being expanded, because what we get here is the first phrase in C major, followed by the second phrase in D minor. So you see the initial idea where we go up a half step as one interval, it has now been expanded to being the harmonic structure that goes up, and the half steps being expanded to a whole step. And also the link between these two we find up in the first flute. We modulate over to D minor by the use of now two consecutive half steps. So you can see how the initial idea from the beginning is now growing and expanding itself. In the following passage, the music begins to get a bit more active. So on. And inside this passage, there's a quite interesting motif. This idea of repeating three notes and then going to a different note is obviously what ends up becoming the main element of the Fifth Symphony. But we can see that already here it's appearing, and it actually appears in quite a lot of Beethoven's works before the Fifth Symphony. For instance, in the Appassionata Sonata. So we can see here this is an example of a motif that is beginning to develop in the composer's mind, and then the culmination of this is when he writes the Fifth Symphony and uses it as its basic motif. You can see it also in other places in this symphony. There's one other quite significant place in the third movement as part of the main theme, where it obviously appears in a different version, because here it appears in duple meter, and in the third movement it appears in triple meter, which is the way that it also appears in the first movement and the third movement of the Fifth Symphony. So you can see how he's beginning to play with this idea already here at the First Symphony. The following passage modulates into the dominant to prepare for the second theme. And again, there's a lot of half steps and a lot of scale-wise movement. And all of this helps keeping the music connected to the initial idea. And as a matter of fact, one good way to analyze this piece would be to take the whole symphony, go through the whole symphony and look at where there are these half steps and where they are expanded and extended into whole steps and into scale passages, and where they appear as part of motifs and melodies, and where they appear between phrases and between bigger passages. And that would be a very good way to get an overview of how this piece develops and also how it's structured. After the modulation, the second theme begins at bar 53. And it is built on ideas that we have already heard. It opens up with a fourth, which obviously comes from the first theme, but now we are omitting the half step, so now we only have the fourth. And instead the half step comes after the fourth and continues downwards in a scale-wise movement. And out of this second theme arises. And then the accompaniment is a figure that also comes from the first theme, this. Now it's been transformed into this. movements in the theme come directly from the passage preceding it. So everything is very connected, but at this point the music has changed character and is much more light and playful. The first theme, which was still warming up, is staying a long time in the same instrument group in the first violins, and the harmonies are changing very slowly. But here in the second theme, different woodwinds take over from each other in every bar, and the harmonies also change every bar, so the music is much freer in all ways. On our way to the final cadence of the exposition, we get an unexpected moment, which begins at bar 77. Here it happens so that the music changes to minor and then modulates away by having the basses and cello descend into a very low register. Now the other strings above it add a very dark atmosphere to it. And so on. And as the cello and basses ascend, we get 3 bars of oboe solo in B flat major. Repeated in G minor with a bassoon added. Again 3 bars. And after that the music takes 3 bars to move back into G major where it came from. The material for this is the same as that of the second theme. This a long note followed by descending scale. Same thing. And also the oboe solo. It's the same idea with a little bit of extra ornamentation added. And this passage gives a very nice contrast to this otherwise very light music. It's as if the music just takes a brief moment to dive into the depths and then re-emerge at the surface. And it adds a little bit more weight to the overall image. And something else that it does is also to break up this regularity of 2 bars and 4 bars that we've had so far, because here the phrases are in 3 bars. The development section goes further with all of these scale-wise ideas, and I won't go through all of them, but just to mention a few. At the beginning of the section, we have just heard this cadence in G major at the end of the exposition, and then G major 7th, and then comes an A major chord, and that's the beginning of the development section. And this A major chord comes very unexpectedly, so the development section begins with a shock, where the music once again rises. It's pushed up from G to A. And back then when we repeat the exposition, we just go back. Very nicely and neatly we settle back into C major. But here, when we continue, this A major chord adds new energy to the music, which makes it go on. Then we go through C minor and E flat major and all the way over to A minor, after which we transition back into the reprise. And the transition is done by again using this rising half step. We get a very firmly established half cadence in A minor. This so now E has been established as a very central note. And what happens is that the E dissolves completely by going into F at piano. And then the F proceeds as the dominant 7th chord, leading back into C, and we're at the reprise. In the reprise, we are back at this theme that repeats itself many times and stays a long time on the same harmony. But at this point, it no longer sounds like it's just warming up, because by now it's played by the whole orchestra fortissimo and in unison. Which means that at this point it's making a very clear statement after all these complicated passages in the development section. So it has a very different function in the reprise than it does in the exposition, because it's no longer just warming up the music. Now it's making the very clear statement that we are back in C major. Also here in the reprise, this idea from the exposition has been expanded now into the longest string of half steps that we get in the symphony. which makes this idea stand out in a much more dramatic way, obviously, at this point. And it also ensures that we stay in C major for the reintroduction of the second theme. In the reprise, the music differs from the exposition by leading into the second theme, which is a very fine detail in the development of the form. Because in the exposition, the music just stops and then the second theme begins. So it's like... and then the second theme begins. But in the reprise, the music leads into the second theme instead. So at this point, the music has been through so much and it has collected so much energy on its way along that it wouldn't make much sense at this point to have the same kind of stop as it did earlier on. And so Beethoven makes sure that there's this constant continuation at this point in the music. From here on, the music continues as it did in the exposition, all the way up until bar 259, which is where the coda begins. And the final cadence of the movement, which occurs leading into bar 277, is made by extending the cadence that we got all the way back at bar 31 to 33, this cadence. It has now been expanded into this. And so on. So we get this falling scale now put against the rising half steps in syncopations. And it's the final fortissimo and the final climax of the movement. And the remaining 22 bars is just a big celebration of the C major chord, which ends like this.